Every time we step into an argument, something inside us starts to scream, not because we want to fight, not because we want to win, but because deep down there's a part of us begging to be heard. Think about it. Have you ever raised your voice, not to overpower the other person, but because you felt like your voice was invisible, like your words were falling into silence, and your feelings were being dismissed like background noise? That frustration, that boiling point, isn't about dominance. It's about desperation, a cry that says, "Please don't ignore what I'm feeling. Please try to understand what I can't seem to say right." Arguments are not battles, they're signals. They're messy, emotional expressions of something far more delicate, the need to be understood. We don't argue to draw blood, we argue because we're bleeding already, inside, quietly, emotionally, and the pain is trying to find a way out. That's why people argue louder when they feel unheard. That's why tears sometimes follow anger and silence follows shouting. Because underneath all of it is a heart aching for connection. When someone starts to raise their voice, it's easy to label them as aggressive. But what if, instead of judging, we paused for a second and asked ourselves, what are they really trying to say? You see, when emotions overwhelm language, the soul starts to speak in intensity. Not because it wants to harm, but because it doesn't know how else to reach out. Because at that point, it's no longer about facts, it's about feelings. It's no longer about who's right, it's about what's real for them. This world taught us to debate, to prove, to convince, but it rarely taught us how to truly listen. Listening not to reply, not to win, but to receive, that's what most arguments are missing. Not more logic, not more proof, but more presence, more patience, more empathy. Because when someone says, "You never understand me," they're not challenging your intelligence. They're expressing emotional starvation. They're saying, "I've been carrying something alone for too long, and I just need someone to sit with it, not fix it, not fight it, just sit with it." You see, most of us are not craving perfect communication. We're craving human connection, the kind that says, "I might not get it fully, but I'm here to try." That one gesture, real listening, can dissolve walls built over years. Because when a person feels seen, the war within them starts to quiet down. The anger softens, the need to prove fades, because finally someone didn't just hear their words, someone heard them. And if you look back at the arguments that truly broke your heart, you'll realize something. It wasn't the topic. It wasn't the words. It wasn't the heat. It was the ache of feeling alone in that moment, the sting of not being understood, the pain of feeling like your feelings didn't matter. That's why you cried later. Not because of the disagreement itself, but because your heart wasn't met with care. So let this be a shift. Let this be the awakening. The next time you're on the verge of an argument, stop for just one breath and ask, what am I really trying to say here? Chances are it's something like, I feel invisible, I feel hurt, I feel afraid, I feel unloved right now, and even though those aren't the words we often use, those are the truths we carry into every conflict. And if you're on the other side of the storm, if someone is yelling, breaking down, or withdrawing, pause and ask, what are they trying to feel safe enough to say? Because behind their anger, there's a wound. Behind their defense, there's a fear. Behind their resistance, there's a longing to be valued. You don't need to agree to understand. You just need to care enough to try. That's what people remember. Not your points, not your rebuttals, but how you made them feel during the argument. We were not designed to fight against each other. We were designed to understand each other. That's where peace is born. Not in silence, not in victory, but in that sacred space where two hearts say, even if we don't see the world the same way, I still choose to see you. And when that kind of understanding shows up, arguments don't destroy relationships, they deepen them. They become turning points, healing moments, because finally The pain found a voice, and that voice was heard without judgment. So no, arguments aren't about winning, they're about reaching, about saying, in the rawest way possible, please hear me, please hold space for what I'm feeling. Please don't let this turn into another moment where I walk away feeling more alone than before. And when we truly understand that, we don't just learn to fight better, we learn to love deeper. Because sometimes that raised voice, the one we flinch at, the one we label as too much, isn't a threat. It's a flare shot into the air, trying to say, I'm drowning emotionally and no one's noticing. Raised voices often echo unheard hearts. People don't yell when they feel safe. They don't scream when they feel seen. They raise their voice when they've lowered it 100 times before and nothing changed. That volume you hear, that's not arrogance, it's exhaustion. It's easy to look at someone mid-argument and say they're overreacting. But what we fail to ask is, overreacting to what? Often, it's not just this moment that broke them, it's every ignored moment that came before. The broken promises, the times they swallowed their feelings, the times they said it's fine, but it never really was. All of it piles up. And when the heart finally breaks its silence, it doesn't whisper, it roars, not to destroy, but to be recognized. And if we're honest, we've all been there. We've all felt that heat in our chest when our words aren't landing. That frustration when someone nods but doesn't really get it. That moment when you're talking, but you're not being heard. It's in those moments we lose our calm, not because we've lost control, but because we've lost connection. Our emotional temperature rises when our emotional needs go unmet. We've been taught to be composed, to be quiet, to not be dramatic. But the truth is, emotional pain doesn't care about composure. When the heart is aching, it doesn't ask for permission to speak, it demands to be noticed. So that raised voice, that outburst, that sudden intensity, that's not the problem. That's the evidence of a deeper problem, a heart that's been overlooked too long, a voice that's been talked over one too many times. And here's what we often forget: people don't raise their voice to hurt you. They raise it because they're hurt. It's not always about the volume, it's about the message underneath. Do I matter to you? Do you see how much this affects me? Will you finally pay attention to what I'm trying to say? That's the heartbeat behind the chaos. If you can train yourself to listen not to the noise, but to the need behind the noise, something beautiful happens. Defensiveness fades, the urge to argue back dissolves, and what's left is a chance to really connect. A chance to say, I hear you. Not just the words, I hear you. And sometimes that's all someone needs to bring the volume back down, not because they're silenced, but because they finally feel understood. And it's in that moment, when someone finally feels heard, that something powerful unfolds. The energy of the conflict begins to shift. The storm doesn't always end right away, but it softens, because now there's a sense that someone is not fighting against them, but with them for understanding. And that's when you begin to see that conflict, at its core, is connection in disguise. It's not the enemy of love. It's one of its rawest, most revealing forms. Because we don't fight with people we don't care about. We don't cry over conversations that don't matter. We don't get hurt by people who don't have a place in our hearts. Conflict shows up where emotions run deep. It shows up when we crave closeness but feel blocked by misunderstanding. It shows up when we want to bridge the distance but don't know how. So instead we push, we argue, we clash, not because we want separation, but because we're desperate for closeness that feels unreachable. Think about how many arguments begin with frustration but end in tears. Think about how often anger is just sadness wearing armor. The fire of conflict can look like destruction from the outside, but what it's often doing is burning down the walls between us, walls built by unspoken expectations, unresolved wounds, unmet needs. That heat. That's the friction of two people trying to collide back into closeness, but not knowing the words to get there gently. We live in a world where we're told to avoid conflict, to walk away, to keep the peace. But peace without truth isn't real peace, it's just silence dressed as harmony. Real peace comes through understanding, and sometimes the only road to that understanding is through the messy, uncomfortable, emotional terrain of conflict. That's where real connection is born, not in the absence of disagreement, but in how we walk through it together. When two people can face conflict and stay, not run, not shut down, not attack, but stay with the intention to understand each other, that's intimacy. That's love in motion. That's what builds trust, because it says, even when it's hard, I won't give up on trying to see you. And when that kind of safety is created, arguments no longer feel like war zones. They become spaces for transformation. So no, conflict isn't a sign something's broken. It's a sign something matters. It's a doorway, sometimes loud, sometimes painful, but always holding the potential to lead us deeper into connection than we've ever been before. If we're willing to open it, to walk through it with empathy instead of ego, we don't lose each other in conflict, we find each other there. And when we find each other there in that raw, unfiltered space where emotions are exposed, what we often discover is this: we were never really fighting each other, we were fighting what we misunderstood about each other. Misunderstanding is the true enemy, not the person standing across from us. It's the invisible wedge that slips between words and warps intentions. It's what takes "I need you" and twists it into "you're never there for me." It's what turns "I'm hurting" into "you don't care." And when that distortion happens, people stop listening and start defending. But imagine this. What if we paused in the middle of the conflict and asked ourselves, what if I've misunderstood their silence, their reaction, their words? That one shift can dismantle an entire argument before it escalates. Because so often, what we take personally has nothing to do with personal attack. It has everything to do with personal pain. The tone that sounds cold might be covering anxiety. The withdrawal that feels like rejection might be someone's way of protecting themselves. The words that cut deep might be coming from a place that's already bleeding. We assume so much in the heat of the moment. We assume intention. We assume meaning. But the truth is, we see others not as they are, but through the filter of our own wounds. And that filter can turn a small disagreement into a perceived betrayal. That's the danger of misunderstanding. It builds walls between hearts that were never meant to be apart. And once that wall is up, every word feels like a threat. Every silence feels like abandonment. And what started as a moment of emotional vulnerability becomes a battlefield of emotional survival. We start defending ourselves from a version of the other person that only exists in our mind, not in their reality. That's why even the most loving relationships can feel like war zones when misunderstanding takes over. But when we choose to stop, breathe, and check the story we're telling ourselves, everything can change. We might find that the person we thought was ignoring us was just overwhelmed, that the one we believed stopped caring was silently carrying their own pain, that the enemy we thought we were facing was never really there, just a misunderstood heart trying to speak a language we hadn't learned yet. So next time emotions rise, let that be the reminder: we are not the enemy. The real problem is the gap between what was said and what was meant. And that gap can be closed with patience, with presence, with the courage to ask, what are you really feeling right now? Because when we fight misunderstanding together instead of fighting each other, We turn conflict into clarity and distance into closeness. And once we close that gap, once we replace assumption with curiosity and judgment with compassion, there's something even greater waiting on the other side. Healing, real, lasting, soul, deep healing, and it begins the moment we let go of the need to be right and choose instead to understand. That shift is not weakness, it's wisdom, because being right might win the argument, but seeking understanding wins the relationship. So many conflicts keep circling the same pain because everyone is trying to be heard, but no one is willing to listen. Everyone wants to be understood, but few are willing to understand. And the longer we stay locked in that pattern, the further we drift. Not because we don't love each other, but because we've made our pride louder than our empathy. But when one person, just one, decides to stop trying to prove a point and starts trying to feel the other person's point, the entire atmosphere changes. It doesn't mean you don't stand up for yourself. It doesn't mean you don't have boundaries. It means you understand that healing doesn't happen through winning, it happens through witnessing, through saying, I see your pain. I might not agree with everything, but I see what it's doing to you. That level of understanding breaks walls faster than any perfect comeback ever could. We think letting go of being right is surrendering power, but in truth, it's claiming a higher power, the power to restore peace, rebuild connection, and reopen the heart. Understanding softens the sharpest arguments. It melts tension, disarms defense, and turns, you never listen, into thank you for hearing me. And when someone feels truly heard, they stop needing to fight for space. They start relaxing into the safety of the conversation. That's where healing begins, not in agreement but in acknowledgement. Because let's be honest, how often have you needed someone to agree with your feelings? Almost never. What you really needed was someone to get why you felt that way, to sit with you in that emotion and not try to fix it or debate it, just honor it. That's what understanding does. It honors another human's truth, even when it looks different from your own. So when you're standing in the heat of conflict, ask yourself, do I want to win or do I want to heal? Because most of the time you can't have both. But when you choose healing, when you choose understanding over ego, you don't just resolve an argument. You begin to repair a bond that was quietly breaking underneath it all. And that's the kind of power that truly changes everything.